Well, we started off and we have talked about, the state of things, some of the, where are we at with transportation today. We've also been starting to talk about the future. And I think that's where a lot of us are really curious and interested about, where's transportation going? So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our next panel, but I am going to make this one comment that our Senator Jeff Brandes, who's a state senator from Pinellas County, made this comment, and this was regarding, Broward County has put a sales tax referendum that includes light rail on their November ballot. And I thought this was a very good comment when Senator Brandes was asked something by the media. He said, "I think the future is too hazy to make those kinds of investments right now. My advice to cities is when you're driving in a fog, you want to slow down." So I think that's kind of appreciated. I mean, we don't know where everything's going. We do know that it's happening. So from this point on in the program, we're really going to be looking at, where's transportation going? And I think you'll enjoy this part of the agenda. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. I'm going to introduce all of them. First, we have Baruch Fiegenbaum. He holds a master's degree in transportation planning from the Georgia Institute of Technology and is currently the assistant director for the Transportation Policy at Reason Foundation. He specializes in revenue and finance, public-private partnerships, highways, transit, high-speed rail, ports, and land use. In a recent article describing Miami's plan to build a redundant light rail project adjacent to an existing bus-only lane rather than simply expanding the bus service on that lane, Baruch quipped, quote, "Politicians don't care about cost-benefit analysis. They know is what they can visualize and what they can cut a ribbon on." Welcome, Baruch. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them all. Our next panelist is Bob O'Malley. Bob O'Malley, you may know him, heard from him if you know CSX. He is Vice President of Government Affairs now for Brightline, overseeing government affairs and community outreach of their Orlando to Tampa expansion efforts, and that makes news here recently. Bob recently joined Brightline after serving 10 years as the Regional Vice President of Government Affairs in Florida for CSX Transportation. Bob previously held position as Director of Central Florida Operations for Tallahassee-based Saks Media Group and Director of Public Affairs and Strategic Planning for MetroPlan Orlando, the regional transportation planning organization for Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties. He is a graduate of the University of Central Florida. O'Malley serves on the board of directors for Associated Industries of Florida, the Winter Haven Chamber of Commerce, the Altamont Springs Municipal Planning Board, and the advisory board for the Center for Urban Transportation Research, Cutter, at the University of South Florida. Welcome, Bob. And our last panelist in this section is Tom Nacero. Tom Nacero graduated from Largo High School and St. Petersburg College in Clearwater, earning both a degree in aerospace technology and a commercial pilot's license. That early education led to a job at Kennedy Space Center that altered the course of his life. And in July 1969, Mr. Nacero became the youngest member of the launch crew for Apollo 11, mankind's first footsteps on the moon. Nacero went on to earn a Bachelor of Science degree in aerospace management, followed by a master's degree from Western Michigan University. After retiring from the Small Business Administration, Mr. Nacero set up 5 Florida companies and assembled a team seeking to bring about a 21st century solution to reduce traffic congestion. The free enterprise solution he'll talk about is becoming known as Aerial Personal Rapid Transit. Today he will introduce the technologies he believes will provide mobility on demand. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Baruch.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. And it goes without saying, thanks to the organizers. We wouldn't have this conference, we wouldn't have this great information without organizers in the community getting out. So Sharon, Karen are very important. The rest of you I don't know, also important. Just just wanted to make sure I mentioned those three. I'll also say I grew up in the Orlando area, so I'm pretty familiar with Florida and how it works. But when I got out of my hotel room this morning and had to walk a while to the parking lot, and I was completely covered in sweat, it reminded me of some of the downsides of the summers here. Anyway, what I want to talk about is what I like to call Plan B. And the reason I call it Plan B is it's actually a plan to improve traffic and transportation mobility in the region. And Plan B is sort of a take on a lot of times you have these agencies and they'll be like, well, you need to adopt our rail plan. It's the only plan. And if you don't do it, your metro area is going to become deserted and a ghost town. It'll be like a post-apocalyptic nightmare. And there is no Plan B. And my response to that is there is a Plan B, and it's actually something that makes sense. It's something that's implementable, and it's something that doesn't require a massive tax increase. So, fabulous. So the presentation overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the spatial structures and why Tampa is not New York. Randall hinted at that a little bit more, but I think some of the numbers are really interesting. Detail a comprehensive congestion reduction plan. Talk a little bit about bus service and the advantages and disadvantages, and then how all of the elements fit together. And the elements fitting together are really important because that's why it doesn't cost so much compared to some of the other alternatives. So, spatial structures. So U.S. metro areas, I divide them largely into two spatial structures, what I call pre-World War II and post-World War II. And there's very few pre-World War II metro areas, but you can think of New York as a good example, is where they developed before the cars were widespread. They developed largely around walking and streetcars, and you have, by the American context, very high central city densities. These are places where rail transit, specifically heavy rail, tends to work real well. The problem is there's not many of these places, and places that are not like this seem to have politicians who think they need to be New York in order to be anything, which doesn't really make any sense for a number of reasons. The post-World War II metro areas largely developed after cars were widespread, much lower central city densities, multiple job centers, jobs widely dispersed. That means people live and work in multiple areas. Examples include Atlanta, Dallas, Tampa, really most Sun Belt regions developed largely after World War II. I think air conditioning had a significant amount to do with that. So let's talk about some of these central city densities. So the ones in green are places where all things equal, transit works well. Now, as Randall pointed out, that doesn't mean it's great. That doesn't mean it's fantastic. It just means it works better than the places in red. And so you can see that what's called the CBD employment, which is the amount of folks working in the central business district, compared to the MSA, that's the metro statistical area employment. And you can see in places like, especially in New York, you've got almost a quarter of the share of jobs in that central business district, which means that's a lot of people that a rail line can move there. But if you look in some of these other places, including Portland, which as John mentioned has been trying to become New York for 40 years, as well as Atlanta and the three major Florida metro areas, Orlando, Miami, and Tampa, you have very few jobs. Look at Tampa, 2.9% of the jobs in the central business district. That is unbelievably low, even by American standards, which are low compared to the world, showing how poor a fit a rail system is for Tampa. If you look at transit ridership, again, these are the percent of commuters that are actually taking transit to their jobs, and then the percent of the percent in the central district that actually makes up the total transit commute. So let me say that again. So transit commuting as a percentage in the central business district, it means people who actually take transit to get there. And the second category is how much of that percentage is of the whole. So, for example, New York City, 76.6%. That means you've got something like, something like 3/4 of the folks taking transit. And of that, more than half of the folks taking transit are going to the central business district. Tampa, you've got 3.1% of people taking transit, which is nothing. And of that, only 5.5% are going to the central business district. Those numbers may look good. They are historically awful. They are awful compared to every metro area in terms of people using transit in the central district. The next thing I want to talk about is grid versus radial. And this is important for how metro areas actually are today. The metro areas that developed before World War II around the rail have a radial orientation, which means that oftentimes people will live in the suburbs and the rail systems will be focused to getting them to downtown. If downtowns have a high percentage of jobs, that can make sense. If downtowns don't have a high percentage of jobs, that doesn't work. The metro areas developed after World War II around a car have a grid orientation. And the reason is because cars can travel on these great things called roads that go in all different directions, as opposed to relying on a rail line. And as a result, you've got more dispersed jobs, you've got different economic activity, and rail doesn't tend to work. And so I mention all of this because I think it's helpful to think of not just numbers and not just factoids, but the overall picture, the overall geography, the overall way the metropolitan area is set up to think of why rail does not work. To sort of, if a politician comes at you and says, oh, I want Tampa to be the next New York. I'm sure you know folks like that. So the solution is what I call a transportation plan for a post-World War II region. And I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that have been hit on before. Managed lanes with bus transit. The managed lanes are the ones that are priced, variably priced. Managed arterials with bus transit, sort of a similar concept on surface streets. A little bit of general highway widening. We'll talk about bus, and then some ITS, which is intelligent transportation systems features. These are things such as traffic signal timing, but not just static, but in real time, so that they can actually be adjusted based on traffic conditions on the road. So, I have a little bit here on the types of transit, because I think when you're being sold transit, you're sold these fixed route rail things. And the reality is there's a lot of different types that would actually work that go beyond rail and beyond bus. And so we've talked about commuter rail, heavy rail, light rail. Those are different types. If anyone has questions, we can get into that in question and answer. There's actually a number of different types of bus too. Your local bus, express bus, which tends to stop in fewer locations, gets you from residential to commercial areas faster. And bus rapid transit, which tends to have often some land use characteristics. There's also express bus. This is if you're in the suburbs and you're going to downtown. You've got very few stops in between, but it's quick. Usually goes on interstates. And now there's a growing array of on-demand. We talked about Uber. We have a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, we have some transit agencies who are actually ahead of the curve that are partnering with Uber and Lyft to offer some of their transit services, because they realize that they don't actually do a very good job in those cases, and maybe their customers would like it if the service was a little bit better. Hey, maybe people will actually take it. You also have this somewhat in rural areas, and then there's a lot of what I would call private and formal. Now, the problem with private transit in most of the country is it's illegal, because it's seen as a competitor with the municipal transit agencies, and we just can't take ridership away from them because they do such a poor job. Well, then who would ride it? Which is interesting. But some places like Atlantic City, you do have jitney service. You also, in some places, are seeing services such as Chariot, which are what I call supplementary. They're these buses that operate in transit areas either that are not well served by traditional, or there's a lot of demand. So probably not Tampa, but think of places like San Francisco. And I say this because the traditional static transit agency does not necessarily have to be the solution. There's a lot of different solutions here that are a lot cheaper and better. So I think I talked enough about the different types of buses. I'm going to move on here in the interest of time. I do want to mention a little bit more about bus rapid transit. So Randall was talking about bus rapid transit in its own lane, or bus rapid transit in a shared right of way. And we call this actually BRT heavy or BRT light. Now, BRT heavy, which operates in a dedicated guideway, is really fantastic if you're in Columbia or if you're in Sao Paulo, where you have, no, my clicker is stopped. There we go. Thank you. Always good to see the presentation I'm talking about. So BRT heavy in Colombia, in developing countries basically. oftentimes authoritarian countries where if the leadership says, we want to take a lane for transit, well, it's kind of hard to say no to that leadership. That's not the country we live in. That's not the country we want to live in. And we don't exactly have the land use patterns to support this BRT heavy. And one of the most frustrating things to me has been there's been a group, maybe you're aware of them, I'm not going to name their names out of professional courtesy, that has been going around Tampa and saying that this BRT light, which is in shared right of way, is not real BRT. Well, it is real BRT. It's real BRT in the American sense of the definition. And I don't think that we necessarily need a group to come in who focuses mainly on the developing countries and tell us the type of transit system that should be used in this country. So BRT light will work fine for most corridors. If there's a corridor with 20 or more buses per hour, which is maybe one in the Tampa area, you can look at BRT heavy. Maybe there's some underutilized streets. BRT has right-of-ways that give buses priority, unique station design, larger vehicles, off-board fare collection, transit signal priority, and frequent service. The most important element of BRT, by the way, is not the dedicated lanes. It is the transit signal priority, which basically means you're allowing the bus to have some sort of preference so it doesn't stop at every light. Because the reason why people don't take buses is several reasons. Two of the most important are the buses look crummy, which is important to actually get a BRT bus that looks good. And two, the bus service is no faster than my car, and I want to be in my car listening to my music, not sitting next to someone I don't know. And that's the importance of the priority signal. I would also say that if you could build a system of BRT in Tampa for 3 light rail lines, maybe 2 light rail lines, because Tampa's not an extensive metro area, same cost. Here are some more transit pictures because I feel obligated to give transit pictures. We'll move on to managed lanes. Managed lanes, and Randall was talking about them, as was John, in terms of congestion pricing. Managed lanes are a little different than straight congestion pricing. What they are is they are lanes where the price varies. It's the same idea, but they are in addition to the general purpose lanes that you have on freeways. And we do that for a lot of reasons. As we saw from some of the question and answer before, people who currently don't tend to be a fan of paying, having their lane converted to a variably priced toll lane, even if that makes their commute better. And so adding the lanes is politically easier, although in the end, in the future, there certainly can be conversion of converting them all to managed lanes or congestion price lanes. So anyway, tolls vary with the level of congestion. The toll prices are set usually to make sure there's a traffic speed of 45 miles per hour or better. Oftentimes, the agency running it will guarantee that speed and will refund the tolls paid if there's not. This doesn't convert general purpose lanes. And I'd like to say the biggest selling point is this is an option. If you've got to get somewhere, we talked about getting the child to daycare, you can take these. If you don't want to pay for them, you want to sit in congestion because you love sitting in congestion and looking at your neighbor's license plate and smelling the fumes or whatever, that's great for you. It's a choice, whatever you want. I also want to briefly mention the transit component of it. One of the reasons why bus transit is cheaper, and particularly bus transit that is sharing lanes, is because you don't actually have to build the right of way. You don't have to build the capital improvements, you also don't need the right of way. It turns out building tracks and wires are actually pretty expensive. We'll move on. So the transit vehicles use these managed lanes as a virtual exclusive busway. They're there with cars. They don't have their own lane, but they can take advantage of these lanes without having to pay the tolls to offer better transit. And that's generally what we do. You'll also see some registered van pools, which is usually 7 or 8 person vehicles getting access to these because that's sort of like a super carpool. Buses more on time, more reliable, usually a better option. I want to briefly talk about managed arterials. This is something that we've actually studied in the South Florida area and something that Florida DOT is interested in. It would be more limited, I think, in this region. What an arterial is, it's the backbone of a transportation network. So if you think of the major street this hotel is off of, that's 6 lanes wide, that's an arterial. There's also collectors and local streets, but let's not worry about that. The idea of the arterials is to move a high level of traffic, almost as much traffic as the freeways, The biggest problem with the arterials is these traffic lights, which tend to take away a lot of the signal time, and there tends to be a lot of congestion around them. So the principle of a managed arterial would be on selected arterials, not all of them, charging a variable toll to use some sort of underpass, bypass, can depend, signalized intersection, and the tolls would start at 15 cents to 25 cents. We did some research in South Florida, and you can actually build underpasses in Florida without having to worry about them flooding. You just have to have a certain pumping system, which turns out to actually not be that expensive. So anyway, this is a different alternative. I don't know if the time is quite ready in this area, but as congestion continues to get worse, it's certainly going to be something to look at. Transit, sort of the same advantage on managed arterials is that they can use these underpasses and overpasses for without having to pay for them to get the same benefits as they do. I talk a little bit here about the ITS systems. So again, that's the traffic signal priority. That's what we call ramp metering, where you're holding traffic on ramps. It's similar to the congestion pricing. It's also been shown if you hold traffic on ramps, you can improve the throughput on your highway significantly, because a lot of the issues are with the merging of the ramps. So just using some of these intelligent transportation systems. I have my little dedicated lane here as a question mark, because I don't know why you need a dedicated lane. But again, some people, they have something to sell you. So, as I mentioned this a little bit before, but the bus-based system is a third to the ninth of the cost, and the guideway is there. There's some advantages to linking bus routes with other bus routes. I think the biggest advantage right now is that you have the private service providers, and those private service providers are exclusively for the metro area transit using buses or other vehicles like that, not using rail. And having a bus-based system can make it much easier to integrate that in. And the challenge is going to get these transit agencies to actually see that they are not the sole provider of transit services. In some cases, maybe they're not the provider of transit services at all, but they perhaps need to have some sort of coordinating role to make sure that the private sector can actually provide better services. I did mention a few other parts of congestion relief. I do think personally there may be some additional general purpose freeway widening that needs to be done in this area. We found that if you have 4 lanes of freeways in both directions, there seems to be some advantages there in terms of merging. I don't think there's going to be a lot of that because most of your freeways are already wide enough, but I put that in there. Talked a little bit about the intelligent transportation system already, so I'm going to get on that. I do want to mention the funding and financing element of it, and this has been talked about before, sort of this user pay, users benefit principles. Drivers should pay for the amount of road they use. Sales tax is probably, in my opinion, is the worst way to fund a highway improvement. I don't like it to fund a transit improvement, like it for anything transportation. Gas tax, tolls, and mileage-based user fees are all better. And we had a proposal in the Atlanta area when I lived there that was going to build all of these rail lines. And one of the ways that was defeated was by getting some folks on the left, particularly the NAACP, and explaining to them how aggressive sales taxes are and how oftentimes the, shall we say, poor neighborhoods don't tend to get those rail line projects. And I just don't know why that is, but okay. Tolls, obviously a better user pay, user benefit system, mileage-based user fee. I like to say the gas tax is what I call a rock star on a farewell tour. It's not dead yet, but it's getting there. I mean, just like the Rolling Stones or whoever have been around for 50 years, and they're always taking their last, this is our last concert. No, this is our last. The gas tax is on its last 10-year concert. And there actually was a proposal at the federal level to increase the gas tax by 10 cents and then eliminate it in 10 years, replacing it with a mileage-based user fee. Now, I'm not advocating for the increase, but I am advocating for the elimination in 10 years. So just put that out there. I think there was a point in time when folks thought these mileage-based user fees was maybe not something that could happen, but because of what Randall discussed before, the improvements in privacy, the different options that states have, it's a real thing now, and we're seeing it in a lot of states. Last slide I want to mention is public-private partnerships. Now, we really like the private sector doing something in all instances where it's feasible. And one of the advantages of these managed lanes and these managed arterials is that there's interest from the private sector to actually get some skin in the game. Now, what the private sector provides, they don't provide funding per se, they provide the financing. It's usually the variably priced tolling that's providing the funding. And so what happens is, by combining sort of 5 stages of building and operating the project, what we call design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, they are able to get a much lower cost and also offer a higher quality project. So let me explain why the roadways under the private sector are often better conditioned than the public sector. In the private sector contracts, there is a penalty if the roadway pavement condition is not at a certain smoothness. Whereas if the public sector is operating it, do you think a public agency is going to penalize itself if the roadway is not in good condition? No, they're not. So what this public-private partnerships do is they actually bring some accountability to the process. And so I mentioned the 5 major advantages here: delivery of the infrastructure, ability to raise revenue, shifting risk from taxpayers to investors, because of course transportation projects never go over budget, provide business-like approach, and then enable innovations. And so that enabling innovations was something that was used in the DC area when we built managed lanes on I-495 in Virginia. And Virginia DOT had a cost that was, for example, $4 billion, just a random cost. And by coming in and looking and changing some of the curves and increasing the medians and saying, do we need an 8-foot shoulder, do we do a 6-foot shoulder, the cost was able to be decreased by 25%. And if you have a major project and you can decrease the cost by hundreds of millions to up to $1 billion, that's a big deal. So that's all I have. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.